Hi everyone, this is General Psychology, and I'm Ryan Keith, and this is my best friend Ruger. I'm here today to talk to you about your memory, how your memory is a lot like Ruger's memory, and how you can use that to make yourself really successful when it comes to school. He's going to go play with his ball for now, and I'm going to talk to you guys about memory. So one of the cool things about psychology being psychology is how easily you can apply the things that we read about and that we talk about in these classes to make yourself successful in this class and every single other one. When we talk about what we know about your memory, this is one of the #1 reasons I like to cover memory so early in these classes. When we talk about your memory and how it works, we can then talk about how we can make your memory really successful. By understanding why you have a hard time with the things that you have a hard time with. A lot of people, for example, complain about math or history or even English, and why certain things seem to come really easy to us. I don't just mean psychology, but something like an art class seems to come really easy. We can come to understand what it is we can do to make ourselves better at the things that seem to be difficult. And a lot of this is based in an understanding of how our memory systems work and the things that we're built to naturally remember easily and the things that we have a harder time remembering. I'm going to talk to you today about a couple of different models of how your memory works and how we can use them to do better. The first I'm going to talk about is one of the most widely accepted models of memory, the information processing model. This is the one that, as your book talks about, focuses on how information is processed in your mind, going from sensory memory to working memory to long-term memory, and representing how your memory isn't one single memory system, but in fact many of these systems. Remember that your sensory memory is like a sensory buffer. You're not aware of it being there, but information that you pay attention to is passed on to your working memory. The goal of your sensory memory is to stitch things together, to kind of help you make sense out of things, fill in gaps, and pass on that stuff that makes sense to your working memory. We can take a key there. Only stuff that you pay attention to is moved on to your working memory. So if you're not paying attention to something, that's like telling your memory system that it's not important and you don't need to know it. When you're studying for an exam, when you're reading for a course, you absolutely have to pay attention to it. If you let yourself get distracted, even for a moment, you put yourself in a position where you end up losing information. So making sure that you're in a situation where you can read, you can study without other people around and distracting you. Make sure you're in a place where you won't be distracted, you won't be interrupted by your friends, by your roommates, by your significant other, by your dog or your kids or anything. Because when you get distracted, you forget things. Make sure that you don't have the TV on. Make sure you don't even have the radio on. It's a funny thing because most of us feel like we need something like music to help us focus, almost like you can get distracted by the silence. And wearing headphones and listening to something like white noise or brown noise can be really effective in blocking out things that would be distracting otherwise. But any piece of music, music with lyrics is the absolute worst because those lyrics distract you, you're listening to them. But even classical music, that if you had a math teacher like mine, they told you that you need to do your work while you listen to classical music because somehow it magically makes you smarter. This doesn't happen. When the classical music, when the symphony swells, when that virtuoso violinist plays a solo, you stop for a moment, you listen for a moment, and you're distracted from that stuff you were paying attention to, and you end up losing it. That information doesn't get passed on from your sensory memory to your working or your short-term memory. Now here we can talk about your working and short-term memory and how to maximize effectiveness there. Your working or your short-term memory, remember there are both of these terms that apply pretty well to it. Your working memory describes what it does. Your short-term memory describes how long stuff is there. That's where information is when you're paying attention to it. When you're reading your textbook, when you're taking notes, that information you're holding in your head, it's in your working memory. While stuff is in your working memory, again, you need to make sure you don't get distracted. But second of all, you have to make sure that you treat that information as important because that is the goal of your working memory. To identify which information is important and pass it on to long-term memory where it'll be kept, and which information is unimportant and to get rid of it. That's what we call forgetting. Now there are a few things you can do to make sure that information stays in your working memory. We know that your working memory has a duration of only about 20 seconds, which means if you're going to remember something longer, you need to be able to rehearse it, specifically using elaborative rehearsal. You can keep something in your head longer by saying it over and over, but if you come up with something new every single time, if you're looking at something in your textbook like the name of a person, a guy like George Miller who developed that magic number 7 plus or minus 2, that is the capacity of working memory, you can talk about what it is he came up with. You can talk about what it is that stuff applies to. You can even think of something about like what this guy looks like. The more information you connect this to, the better you're going to be able to remember it. And this gives you new ways to remember this information. So keeping it in your working memory and finding new ways to store that information, right, creates that elaborative rehearsal that helps you remember that information longer, at least while you're writing it down and taking notes. In addition, we know that the capacity of your working memory is limited. George Miller originally said this capacity was 7 plus or minus 2 items, so as many as 9 or as few as 5. But as your book talks about, it's really about 3 or 4 chunks. Chunks of information are groups of information, related information put together. And we know that if you group information together, you can remember more. Kind of like how it's really hard to remember a string of random numbers, but if you group them using dashes, like in your Santa Fe ID or in a phone number, you can remember a lot more. Do the same thing with your textbook. Be sure to group this information. I once had a student tell me that they felt like reading textbook chapters felt like reading a series of really short news articles, lots of disconnected information. And you know, if you approach your textbook that way, it's actually really helpful. Don't try to focus for hours on end reading the whole chapter. Read a little bit at a time, only related information, so that you can help yourself chunk this information together. In addition, we know that you lose information out of your working memory, just like with your sensory memory, when you get distracted. This is because we tend to fall prey to interference. Try to think about, like, if you're trying to remember somebody's phone number and someone comes up and talks to you, it forces you to jettison that phone number and you just lose it. This is really, really, really bad for trying to remember stuff. So when you're sitting there and you're trying to study and you get distracted, not just by music or TV, but by the very device I'm using to record this video, something like your phone, it's going to cause you to lose that information. And you know that turning your phone on silent, placing it face down, that's not going to help at all, right? Because ultimately it's not the phone that's the problem, it's you and me that's the problem. Because as much as you tell yourself you're putting that thing away, you know, you get reading 5 minutes and then you say, well, you know, you deserve a treat, you deserve a break. You post, I posted some really funny tweet earlier and I just have to like see how many retweets and mentions and favorites that I got on the thing, right? And before you know it, you're 20 minutes into checking your news feed, into looking at something that your friend said, and you've lost all that information from what you were studying. Whenever you introduce something new, especially into your conscious awareness, you can only really focus on one thing at a time, no matter how good of a multitasker you think you are. And whenever you introduce something new into your conscious awareness, it forces you to push aside that other thing you were working on. If that information in your textbook, if the information in these videos, if the information in the stuff I've assigned is important, you need to treat it like it's important so you can move it on to your long-term memory. Now, when we get to long-term memory, an important thing to remember is that your long-term memory is not a single memory system, but many of them. And if we understand how these different memory systems work, we can understand like how your memory works the same way Ruger's does. And then we can pay attention to why it is certain things seem to be easier to remember than others. For example, your procedural memory, which is a kind of implicit memory. These are things that are stored automatically, whereas what comes from a textbook, you seem to have to work really, really hard to try to learn. If you approach your textbook kind of like a history textbook, as if it's a procedure, as like a list of terms you have to remember, you're going to have a hard time with it. But if you approach the textbook as if some of this information is procedural, you know how information is passed between the different memory systems, you're going to have a much easier time remembering it. Once you know how a piece of machinery works, once you know how a recipe works, you don't forget how to make it. Maybe you forget exactly how much of one ingredient goes in or exactly how long something has to cook on the stove. But if you know what a consistency is supposed to be like, if you have a general idea of how it works, you just don't forget it. In addition, even when we look at explicit memories, right, there are different kinds of explicit memories. We have semantic memories, which are things you know, like facts that you get from a textbook, and these are really, really hard things to remember. Your brain isn't built to remember these things. The other kind of memory that we have in explicit memories are episodic memories or autobiographical memories, and these are memories that you remember really easily, just like how Ruger does. Ruger remembers me throwing his ball, he remembers where we are, he remembers things that happened to him automatically. If you approach a textbook looking at the name of a person, you try to memorize a person and a date and a contribution, you're going to forget it. But if you understand who that person is, if you try to understand what they did, almost like it's an experience that happens to you, you understand what it is they did, how it is they did that thing. If you approach it like it's the kind of memory that you're built to remember, you're going to have a much, much easier time remembering it. One of the things that a lot of students tell me is that they have to read the textbook right before they get into taking a quiz, something like that, because they know that there's no way they're going to be able to keep that information in their heads over the course of a couple of days before the quiz. I know exactly that feeling, like you're going to jettison everything. But that kind of leads to a question that if you can't remember the information for a couple of days, how are you going to remember it for a couple of weeks or several weeks before the exam, right? Well, one of the things we know about your long-term memory is that it keeps information, of course, that's important, but it mostly keeps information that we tend to rehearse, information that we bring from our long-term memory into our working memory, from storing unconsciously to remembering consciously. And the more you force yourself to remember that information, the more likely you are to remember it later. This is, of course, what we call studying. The more you return to this information, the more you study this information, the more you force yourself to recall this information on a regular basis, the more likely you are to remember it later. So don't cram your textbook the night before you've got a quiz. Don't cram in your textbook the day that you've got a quiz. You've got to start reading early and then restudying, rehearsing, remembering that information over and over and over. This isn't just like practicing and strengthening a muscle. It's a way to tell your brain, it's a way to tell your memory system that this information is important information. And it's information that needs to stick around, not just over the course of a couple of days, but over the course of several weeks or hopefully maybe even years. So I hope you guys learn a little bit about memory. Good luck on studying for quizzes and exams, and I'll see you guys in the next mini lecture.